Let's continue talking about this GB Energy that you've mentioned. This is the company, as it is, that the Labour Party are going to set up in a quest for clean energy. Now, of course, when this was first billed some time ago, it was billed as something that would actually produce energy. That was the plan, and it was going to cost tens of billions of pounds. That's now been dumbed down to something that's going to cost rather less than that. And it seems the reason, I can't believe that more hasn't been made of this, frankly, Alan, that it's only a hedge fund, effectively. It's a fund, it's an investment vehicle. It's not actually going to produce any energy whatsoever. That's rather surprising, and it will be surprising to people listening to this, thinking that one of the central planks of the Labour Party manifesto in their aim to take government actually isn't really what we thought it was at all. Have we been gaslit here by the Labour Party?
Well, it's
no
kind
pun
of hard
intended,
to say,
by the way.
It's windlit. I think what's interesting is that I think that what GB Energy has become now, I think it's still unsure what it's going to be as it goes forward. You're right. At the moment, it's about bringing in direct investment.
But Alan, sorry, shouldn't we be sure? I mean, sorry, the Labour Party have just seized Downing Street. They've just, electorally and properly. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but I mean, it's a bit late for them to be saying, yeah, we're not quite sure what it's going to be yet. We thought it was going to be this, but now it's not. I mean, they used it as a mechanism to gain the power of government.
Yeah, I don't think they intentionally misled. I think that it's probably to the point where it's interesting because it's quite an interesting branding exercise, because effectively it's kind of a form of nationalisation, but it's sort of draping that in the kind of in patriotism, really, rather than sort of nationalisation being this kind of terrible thing you have to do as kind of a last resort when things are going badly. They're sort of saying it's a positive thing. It's GB Energy. It's about kind of sovereignty and energy supply and securing all that kind of stuff. But as you're right, it's not actually about necessarily the production of energy. It's simply about creating the situation where much more energy production can be done in the UK in a much more secure and cheaper way, and effectively then leads to that transition.
And to be clear, they're going to use taxpayers' money, about £8 billion, as I understand it, to invest in private businesses that produce so-called sustainable energy. That's going to take years, decades, surely. I mean, it just seems like a headline that was used to grab our attention and make it look good. The ultimate greenwashing, frankly. It's not really what it's set out to be at all. I feel a bit conned, Alan.
Well, I think what's interesting is that for a long time, you're right, that they did talk about how much it was going to impact on people's bills. And they did, Ed Miliband, who is going to actually, as Secretary of State, is going to be the person in charge of GB Energy. He talked a lot about how much it was going to take off people's bills, £300 of people's bills. Yeah. And if you heard him to the media round this morning, he's a bit more reticent about that. And obviously we have independent forecasters. Surprise.
So what you're saying is now they've been elected to government, the £300 bribe that they suggested to the British public per household in terms of energy savings has now disappeared.
He now says that it will bring down bills eventually.
But how? Can you try and explain to us? I know, look, I'm not suggesting it's your policy. I'm not asking you to be a Labour apologist, but how on earth is investing in hundreds of billions of pounds worth of new infrastructure, getting rid of gas and oil, relying on unreliable energy from solar and wind, how does that then come out the other side of the energy sausage machine with bills that are £300 per year lower for the average household? They've clearly not explained this, but do you want to have an attempt at explaining that weird maths?
Well, I could go into sort of contracts for difference in the way that gas is brought into the UK and that kind of stuff, but that'd be far too boring for all of your viewers. Broadly, what I will say is that if you look at how much it costs to create a kilowatt of energy via wind and solar, as opposed to via something like liquid gas or even coal, that kind of stuff, it is much, much cheaper, and it would continue to get cheaper as the technology gets better, the infrastructure gets better, and that essentially is their broad plan: is that the more wind there is as part of the mixture, more solar as part of the mixture, that will overall decrease the cost of producing that energy, and therefore
even allowing for the cost of building the turbine out of steel and concrete and shipping it from the other side of the world to us.
Right, and that essentially is the difficulty in getting that, and certainly in getting the difficulty in getting that. Yeah. Saving to you quickly, as opposed to it happening over a longer period of time as they start to build back the money that was spent on the initial outlay.
So, Alan, now that we talked about that, I now want to turn back to this Manchester police issue, the situation at Manchester Airport, which you would have seen. What's your initial take on what happened? And by the way, viewers and listeners, we're going to keep talking about it because this, without doubt, is the biggest story of the last 24 hours. This is going to run and run and run. It's polarised opinion in the debate with regard to, even though it's clear that obviously there's an investigation that will now be ongoing, the officer himself has been suspended, and we'll wait to see the outcome of that investigation. But pending that, obviously we have some footage, not all footage of the entire situation. But so there's lots of opinions, some particularly on the left saying, well, that officer's clearly out of order and he should be suspended and potentially charged and imprisoned, I saw on Twitter today, versus some that are saying, look, actually, if you go to an airport and start attacking police officers that have got guns and lurch for their guns, then perhaps some would say you deserve what you get in terms of being robustly subdued. What's your take on it, Alan?
Well, I think the point you mentioned there is that we haven't seen the context of what happened up until that point. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of time for that full investigation to look at all the circumstances around that sort of very short clip that we've got. I would just say that, clearly that person, you talk about being subdued, that person was clearly prone, face down on the ground. I don't think there can be any justification in my mind for applying that level of force to someone who was already prone on the ground.
But we don't know if they were incapacitated. We don't know if they were shouting threats. I mean, we don't know, do we, until the end of the investigation? I mean, we should definitely have an open mind on this, shouldn't we? And also, I don't know if you heard, we had a guest on earlier on who was a former firearms officer, Harry Tanguy, and he was very, very clear that, look, when it comes to people going for your weapon in an airport situation, so in an environment as sensitive as that, clearly you act and react robustly. He said in some situations, and certainly in some countries, if a potential assailant had gone for an officer's weapon, he would have been shot and disarmed in that way by that officer's colleagues. So I guess in context, what we're seeing here on the screen here in terms of this assailant, this criminal, because he had already attacked police officers, doing what, being treated the way he was, the consequences of that particular person or his colleagues, his mates, grabbing hold of a firearm could have been absolutely catastrophic, particularly in a busy airport situation.
I agree with you, but I will say two things about that. One is that clearly in the footage he is said lying face down. He's not reaching for the person's gun. He certainly wasn't at the point where the officer came and kicked him in the head. And secondly, I would say that we shouldn't necessarily grade the actions of our police officers in this country by the actions of police officers in other countries. We have a clear, code of conduct. We have clearly had quite a light touch level of policing in this country for a long time, and we're something that we're definitely proud of. And therefore, that's why
not when they're too light touch on the streets of Leeds a few days ago, not when they allowed pro-Palestinian protesters to shout anti-Semitic chants at Jews in the street. I mean, that's too light touch.
Yeah. That's why, because of that, that's why when we see actions like this, that level of violence and force used, that's why I think it is so shocking to people, I think. And that's why, it's going to be very difficult to justify that, regardless of when we do find out that the full context to everything that took place at the airport last night.
Yeah, given that disparity, and we talked about this earlier on, actually, that almost the two extremes that we see almost on a weekly basis with regard to the way the police deal with people. How do we resolve that, do you think? I mean, how on earth can the police get this right so that they are seen to be proportionate, even-handed and appropriate, and indeed to be policing by consent, because that is very, very important?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems that they've drifted away, doesn't it? No matter what you think about this Manchester Airport incident, that they do seem to be roundly criticised, either A, for being too lean and lenient, or, on the other hand, being, as we've seen here, too heavy-handed. What do we do to resolve this? What do the police do to resolve that disparity?
Yeah, well, it's one of the many reasons I'm glad that I'm not the Home Secretary, because I think it's part of a bulging intro of one of the things that she's got to try and sort out, things that obviously clear problems with the Met Police we've seen over a long period of time that she has part operation control over. And the fact is that I think that on the trust amongst people, so that policing by consent only works when the public trusts the police to be able to act in the right way and to protect them in the ways they need to and investigate when they need to. The Times did a big commission on crime recently that suggests that the levels of trust amongst people are rock bottom at the moment. Things like shoplifting, though they're seen as low-level crimes.
We've talked about it on this show. Shoplifting cases are 30% up this year on last year. And there are nearly 500,000 recorded offences, let alone the offences that go unrecorded.
And that's one of the things which I think to an individual is not the most awful thing that could happen to you, but it damages your trust in the police. And the fact that it's continuously over and over and over again is not investigated. Things like bike theft. I don't know about you. Every bike I've ever owned has been stolen, and none has ever been recovered by the police. Right.
So, but also burglary, car crime. I mean, it's right.
Yeah.
Not only is burglary and car crime up across the nation, but the solve rate now, the resolution of such things, the detection rate as it is, has plummeted. I mean, as I understand it, the detection rate of car crime is about 2%. Burglary detection rate, 6%. When do you see a police officer by way of deterrent? Where I live in Essex, you hardly ever see them. You only ever see them when they're responding to something. But,
right, exactly.
I don't blame the rank and file, Alan. I blame the senior police management. It seems the academic woke types that simply probably many of them have never really spent any time on the front line at the coalface and really aren't covering themselves in glory when it comes to it being a police force rather than a police service. As I said earlier on, it needs to be a police force, not a police service. Alan Tolhurst, Chief Reporter and podcast host from Politics Home, thank you very much indeed for that interaction. Very interesting indeed.